我宣布，安全理事会第9112次会议现在开始。本次会议的临时议程是维护国际和平与安全，加强对话合作，维护共同安全。议程通过。按照安理会暂行议事规则第39条，我邀请不扩散核武器条约缔约国第10次审议大会主席斯劳维宁先生阁下参加本次会议。就这样决定。安理会现在开始审议议程项目2。我仅提醒安理会成员注意 S2022-617号文件，即2022年8月12日中国常驻联合国代表给联合国秘书长的信，其中附有关于本项目的概念文件。正如信中所说，安理会成立的初衷是实现所有人的共同安全，维护国际和平与安全也是联合国的常规议题。近年来，这一常规议题显得越来越紧迫，安全困局越来越难解。政局动荡、军事冲突、恐怖威胁、新冠疫情、自然灾害等能源、粮食危机等等安全挑战复杂交织，世界远不太平。似乎每个国家都在为实现自身安全而努力，结果却是各国的不安全感都在上升。面对新的形势，安理会有必要重温初心使命，更好地回应各方期待，更好地履行维护国际和平与安全的责任。这在当前背景下具有十分重要的现实意义。今天的公开会主题定为加强对话合作，维护共同安全，目的就是希望各方通过冷静和理性的对话，对涉及国际安全的根本性问题做一些深入的思考。我们到底需要什么样的国际安全？当前形势下，怎样才能走出冲突动荡，避免更大规模的安全灾难？联合国能够发挥什么样的作用？我期待大家以前瞻性的视野和负责任的态度，聚焦今天的会议主题，并贡献真知灼见。我现在荣幸地请联合国秘书长古特雷斯先生阁下发言。
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you, Mr. President, for convening the Council on this essential topic. Our collective security demands that we seize every moment to forge a common understanding of the threats and challenges before us, and most importantly, to shape united responses to them. As the focus of this briefing makes clear, the path to peace is forged by dialogue and cooperation. I have just returned from Ukraine, Turkey, and Moldova, and I look forward to speaking further about this visit on Wednesday. There, I saw the Black Sea Grain Initiative in action, an initiative to get grain and other vital food supplies moving again through Ukrainian ports. In parallel, we have an agreement to facilitate unimpeded access to global markets for food and fertilizers originating from the Russian Federation. Mr. President, this comprehensive plan is crucial for the world's most vulnerable people and countries who are desperately counting on these food supplies. Above all, it is a concrete example of how dialogue and cooperation can deliver hope, even in the midst of conflict. The same commitment to dialogue and results must be applied to the critical situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I reaffirm that the United Nations has in Ukraine the logistics and security capacities to support the mission of the International Atomic Energy Agency from Kyiv to Zaporizhzhia. And we continue the relentless search for peace in Ukraine and across the globe in line with the United Nations Charter and international law. Mr. President, this Council represents a vital part of the process of peace and prevention through resolutions to cease conflicts, support reconciliation, and provide humanitarian assistance and support to millions of people in need. But, Mr. President, today's collective security system is being tested like never before. Our world is riven by geopolitical divides, conflicts, and instability. From military coups to interstate conflicts, invasions, and wars that stretch on year after year. Lingering differences between the world's great powers, including at this Council, continue to limit our ability to collectively respond. Humanitarian assistance is stretched to the breaking point, and human rights and the rule of law are under assault. Trust is in short supply. Many of the systems established decades ago are now facing challenges that were unimaginable to our predecessors: cyber warfare, terrorism, and lethal autonomous weapons. And the nuclear risk has climbed to its highest point in decades. Mr. President, the tools that have kept us from catastrophic world war are more important than ever. But they must be fit for today's rapidly deteriorating international peace and security environment. We need to reforge a global consensus around the cooperation required to ensure collective security, including the work of the United Nations. And that is also the driving force behind my proposal for a new agenda for peace contained in the report on our common agenda. Through it, we are exploring the diplomatic toolbox of the UN Charter to end conflicts, especially Chapter 6 provisions around negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. But we are also putting a focus on prevention and peace building. This including strengthening our foresight of future threats and anticipating flashpoints and long-standing conditions that could explode into violence. It includes exploring new and expanded roles for regional actors and groups, particularly as cross-border threats to peace and security emerge. It includes putting human rights first in political and financial investments that can address the root causes of conflict, from social protection and education to programming to end violence and discrimination and increase women's participation across civic and political life. It includes the capacity of establishing new social contracts that build and strengthen the bonds of trust between people who inhabit the same borders, and in the governments and institutions representing them, so all people can lend their hands to building peace. And it includes joint efforts to gather countries around the need to reduce risks stemming from cyber warfare and lethal autonomous weapons. And it includes accelerating efforts to eliminate the nuclear threat once and for all. The 10th Review Conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons meeting these months must demonstrate that progress is possible. I renew my call to all states parties to demonstrate flexibility and the willingness to compromise across all negotiations. And countries with nuclear weapons must commit to the no first use of those weapons. They must also assure states that do not have nuclear weapons that they will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against them, and be transparent throughout. Nuclear saber-rattling must stop. We need all states to recommit to a world free of nuclear weapons and to spare no effort to come to the negotiating table to ease tensions and end the nuclear arms race once and for all. Monsieur le Président, l'avenir de l'humanité est aujourd'hui entre nos mains. En cette période de risque maximal pour notre monde, il est temps de renouveler notre engagement envers la Charte des Nations Unies et les idéaux qu'elle représente. La meilleure solution pour tenir la promesse de la Charte de préserver les générations futures du fléau de la guerre, c'est de remplacer la division par le dialogue et la diplomatie, de négocier, de trouver des compromis et de rendre des comptes à l'avenir. Ce Conseil et cette organisation représentent les nations du monde entier et constituent le meilleur espoir de l'humanité pour bâtir un avenir meilleur et plus pacifique. Alors que nous élaborons notre nouvel agenda pour la paix, à nous de prouver que nous avons tiré les leçons du passé. Réitérons notre engagement envers les instruments éternels de la paix, le dialogue, la diplomatie et la confiance mutuelle. Je vous remercie.
感谢秘书长先生刚才所得的通报，感谢他所贡献的思考和建议。我现在请施劳维宁先生阁下发言。
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, allow me to start by thanking you, Mr. President, for the invitation to speak today on such an important topic. For the last 3 weeks, just across the hallway, the state parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons have been engaging in an in-depth discussion on how to strengthen that essential instrument of our common security. I'm aware that not all members of this Council are parties to the NPT. Nevertheless, it is my hope that all Council members could appreciate the important role played by the treaty as a contribution for the betterment of the international security environment. Since its entry into force in 1970, the NPT has proven to be a bulwark of international peace and security, and a key facilitator of the benefits of nuclear energy and nuclear applications. Over its 52-year history, the treaty has proven itself remarkably resilient and adaptable. Its near universal membership speaks for itself. State parties' current engagement on discussions speaks volumes about the conference's status as the de facto multilateral negotiating forum on all things related to nuclear weapons. As a consequence of the geopolitical turmoil rocking our world since February this year, the NPT faces a raft of challenges, the diversity and scope of which are unlike anything that has come before. And still, throughout these 3 weeks, I have witnessed that state parties have come resolved to strengthen the global regime that spans the 3 pillars of the treaty, meaning nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Mr. President, as far as priorities go, the implementation of the treaty's provisions is front and center for many, if not most, of the state parties. Ensuring fulfillment of the treaty's core commitments and obligations is seen as essential to the treaty's enduring success. For many, this is especially the case for disarmament commitments, nuclear disarmament commitments, including those made at prior review conferences, such as the unequivocal undertaking to eliminate nuclear arsenals. There are few issues more vital to our common security than preventing any use of nuclear weapons. And as many believe, the only way to completely eliminate the risk of a nuclear weapon being used again is to completely eliminate those weapons. This is the crux of the issues that the NPT states parties are grappling with. How to reinforce the 7-decade-old non-use of nuclear weapons, and to take urgently needed steps towards a world free of nuclear weapons. Whether state parties can make progress and strengthen the implementation of all three of the NPT's pillars depends on agreement on several key areas, in my view. First, given current global conditions and recent events, it should be no surprise that concerns have only grown regarding the need for urgent action under Pillar 1 of the treaty, nuclear disarmament. Such measures are needed to reverse dangerous trends, increase confidence, and ensure that mistakes or miscalculations do not lead to escalation and catastrophe. In addition, the current global security environment has revived the narrative that nuclear weapons provide the ultimate security guarantee. This is an extremely damaging narrative and dangerous for non-proliferation, especially when coupled with other challenges to non-proliferation, such as hedging and emerging technology that can lower the barriers to the acquisition of nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles. Second, on near-term measures to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons. The norm against the use of nuclear weapons is one of the most important achievements of the post-World War II era, but it is increasingly threatened. The heightened nuclear risk has, on the other hand, strengthened calls for immediate risk reduction measures, and on the other, been taken by many as further evidence for the urgent need to accelerate nuclear disarmament. It has also brought back to the fore questions about how to strengthen security assurances, a long-standing concern of non-nuclear weapon states, that will now be front and center in our minds. Risk reduction remains a priority for many, as I said, especially at the intersection between nuclear weapons and new domains in cyber and outer space, and with new technologies from artificial intelligence to hypersonic weapons. But for many others, they have argued that risk reduction is not enough. They believe that circumstances demand immediate action on irreversible and verifiable nuclear disarmament. This will likely include calls for a strong language on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, as well as new agreements to reduce the global number of nuclear weapons and arsenals. Third, how to support the resolution of regional proliferation crises, especially in Asia and the Middle East. There is broad agreement about the need to strengthen the non-proliferation regime against an array of emerging challenges. Assisting the resolution of regional proliferation challenges, therefore, remains a high priority for state parties. From the Middle East to Northeast Asia, the introduction of nuclear weapons into any regional conflicts will amplify the danger by an order of magnitude. State parties are all too aware that failure to address these cases weakens the entire non-proliferation regime. Fourth, how to broaden access to the benefits of peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology. The NPT has proven to be a facilitator of the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology, the benefits of which continue to grow. This nexus between development and security adds a new dimension to the treaty, one that reflects its continued centrality in the international system. And as the role of nuclear technology becomes more and more prominent in areas from agriculture to medicine, ensuring the widest possible reach of those benefits becomes increasingly important, especially as a catalyst for fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. Fifth and finally, how to ensure the safety and security of nuclear power plants in conflict zones. Recent events have focused attention on these issues as the world has been forced to confront, for the first time, the challenges posed by nuclear safety and security in a zone of armed conflict. Mr. President, the Review Conference is a unique opportunity to strengthen an instrument of common security in a forum of dialogue and cooperation. It is not something that should be squandered. When we talk about the need to find common ground, I think we forget that the NPT is common ground. Protecting it keeping it fit for purpose, and making sure it can continue its role as a bastion of international peace and security is and must be a priority for all. For more than 50 years, the NPT has proven itself to be an essential and adaptable element of every state party's security. This is why, and despite the current circumstances, I have made all efforts during this review conference and before that, and I will continue to do it until we arrive at the end of this process this Friday, to promote dialogue and cooperation among state parties as the main foundations of negotiations. And I believe it is essential to stress the importance to focus on the elements that unite us and not the ones that divide us. And we need flexibility and political will to negotiate in good faith, to support an outcome from the review conference that ensures the NPT remains fit for purpose in these turbulent and troubling times, and in turn, strengthening our common security. Thank you.
我感谢施劳威宁先生阁下刚才所做的通报。下面我邀请安理会成员发言。首先，请阿联酋代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to first thank China for organizing this important meeting and to express our gratitude to the Secretary General and to Mr. Gustavo Slavinen for their invaluable briefings. Mr. President, a press item covering the 1945 San Francisco Conference reported that the delegates had signed, and I quote, "a charter written for a world of power, tempered by little reason." The architects of the United Nations needed only to look around them for insight into the ruin wrought by unrestrained power. The story of short-sighted ideological and hegemonic pursuits had echoed across human history, each time with greater dissonance. So in an act of necessary but extraordinary ambition, they committed to building something better. They envisioned an international order in which people express their right to self-determination through equally sovereign states that resolve their differences with dialogue and without the threat of wars of aggression. They sought to temper power by binding together in common security and prosperity those who may wield it and those who may suffer it. Since then, with pragmatism, creativity, and leadership, and despite many challenges to these lofty ideals, the system has held. This achievement in itself should give us some comfort in this moment of rising polarization and fragmentation. As the bold vision of an open, cooperative, and inclusive world order is vindicated by the scale of our global challenges, we cannot entertain abandoning it, whether through revisionism or retrenchment. Instead, the UAE firmly believes that this must be a moment of renewal for the international system. Our cooperation is necessary if we are indeed to address the world's most urgent threats, and the crises on this Council's agenda will not relent in their demands for our collective efforts. As we grow ever more reliant on each other, our first and only truly global multilateral system is still our last best hope. However, it cannot remain frozen in time. It must adapt to a world with more countries, an increasingly diverse set of influential actors, a shifting balance of power, an expanding role for regional institutions, and the growing risk of tensions between major powers. And it is to the credit of this inclusive system that it now relies on a much wider circle of members and stakeholders than it did at its creation. These include some 80 countries that secured independence during decolonization, as well as the engagement of private sector and philanthropic actors and local and global networks of youth and women and civil society. But to fully reap the benefits of that progress, institutional responsibility must also expand. For example, for a long time, the multilateral system has been divided between the so-called norm makers and takers. However, wider ownership of the system could ensure greater investment in its success. Countries historically limited to merely norm-taking have the capacity to play a more active role in setting and upholding the agenda. Collectively, we must fashion a more inclusive system of norm-setting and decision-making to allow the views of all to shape our inextricably bound future. And in doing so, as others have said, we must be pragmatic, incremental, and results-oriented. We should prioritize those common challenges that genuinely concern all of us and that can only be resolved if we work together. Climate change, pandemics, food and water insecurity, poverty, gender inequality, energy supply, terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We should actively seek out our partnerships, especially with those with whom we may not always agree. We cannot sacrifice crucial agreement for complete agreement. Broadening responsibility also means systematically empowering regional organizations to solve regional problems. They're often better placed to find sustainable solutions as they bring the nuanced understanding and the greater willingness to compromise. And the Council should creatively and intentionally leverage the tools at its disposal to support those organizations and reinforce their efforts with the financial support needed for those changes and not only paying it lip service. More than anything, this is a time and a place for determined leadership. The issues on our agenda are not zero-sum games. In the long term, cooperation leads to better outcomes for all. But self-interest begets self-interest, and that must inform the efforts to reverse its corrosive effects. We need this leadership that can overcome the binary approach to coalition building. The us versus them lens may clarify current divides, but at the risk of obscuring the urgency of longer-term challenges. Mr. President, we all have a stake in the preservation and success of the multilateral system, but the stakes are clearly not equal for some, including those caught in geostrategic crossfire. What is at stake is their very survival. Cognizant of that fact, the most effective of our predecessors in these chairs tried to manage their differences and disagreements in a way that allows the UN to remain responsive to those who need it the most. The world looks to this chamber to summon that spirit once again and, in the process, usher in the necessary renewal of an open, cooperative, and inclusive world order. Thank you, Mr. President, for this timely discussion.
我感谢阿联酋代表的发言，下面请巴西代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank China for convening this briefing and the Secretary General for his important remarks. I would also like to thank Ambassador Gustavo Slauvinen for his insightful intervention. While it is important to clarify that the decisions regarding the NPT review process are the exclusive and collective competence of the states parties to the treaty, the fact that, for the first time, the president of an ongoing RevCon briefs the Security Council in an official meeting is a positive sign. It shows that the body, which bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is attentive to the main multilateral discussions taking place beyond the walls of this chamber. Ambassador, you can rest assured of Brazil's full support for your efforts to reach a balanced, meaningful, consensual outcome document for the conference. Brazil is convinced that we are in the best hands to lead the way. Mr. President, we need to take certain steps for achieving a safer and more peaceful world. First, we need to overcome, once and for all, the false narrative that nuclear weapons make the world a safer place. In reality, such weapons spawn an elusive and precarious security. Their mere existence invites further proliferation, undermines global stability, and compromises international security, putting the whole world at existential risk. The substantial increase in nuclear tensions since the beginning of this year is a powerful demonstration of this fact. As we kickstart the final week of the NPT RevCon, we cannot lose sight of our common objective of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament is not a concession on the part of nuclear weapon states. It is an unequivocal commitment and a binding obligation in accordance with Article 6 of the NPT. While nuclear risk reduction measures are important and necessary, they are by no means a panacea for our atomic malady, let alone a substitute for nuclear disarmament. We must always keep in mind the fragile balance between the three pillars that allowed for the adoption of the NPT. This balance is the only way to ensure that the treaty can remain relevant. Second, prevention is a better cure, as conventional wisdom reminds us. The international community should make more frequent use of preventive diplomacy and mediation. It should focus more on Chapter 6 than Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It should condemn the abusive use of Article 51. The law of action and reaction is especially applicable to the use of force, which tends to generate further use of force in a chain reaction. Insisting on the peaceful settlement of disputes is the only way to get out of this vicious circle. Third, there can be no stability where the rule of law does not prevail. Respect for international law is crucial for peaceful international relations. International law is the language we must speak when differences arise among us. International humanitarian law protects us from further damage when conflict regrettably breaks out. International human rights law and international refugee law, by protecting individual rights and thus saving lives, may avoid trauma and resentment, which are among the root causes of conflict, and they are key for any reconciliation process. Fourth, it is of paramount importance to acknowledge the strong and reinforcing relationship between peace and economic and social development. There can be no development without peace, and no lasting peace without development. A new agenda for peace will only be successful if it has its foundations on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. A strong economic foundation and robust productive capacities are the path to job and wealth creation, solid fiscal revenues, debt sustainability, political and social stability, and ultimately peace. Strengthening international cooperation, investing in productive capacities, and combating poverty and hunger must remain at the heart of our deliberations in this organization. In addition, we must not forget that developing countries are manifestly underrepresented in peace and security decisions. There is a pressing need to move forward the discussions on the Council's reform, and we invite all member states to constructively engage in the intergovernmental negotiations. Fifth, durable peace requires comprehensive approaches that could benefit significantly from the support of the Peace-Building Commission. The PBC is well suited to work as a platform to promote greater coordination among relevant partners of a particular country at risk of lapsing or relapsing into conflict. Additionally, it can mobilize regional organizations and international financial institutions and foster South-South and triangular cooperation arrangements in support of national peace-building initiatives. The Commission can also support the implementation of peace-building activities by peacekeeping operations and to help mobilize political support to promote reconciliation, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, institution building, and other nationally defined peace-building priorities. Mr. President, this briefing brings about a timely discussion. We look around and we see war, conflict, terrorism, pandemic, and poverty. The fear of nuclear devastation looms at our doors, and this fear is currently heightened. As the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute pointed out, interstate conflict has been on the rise. Wars and ill-devised sanction regimes disrupt supply chains, spread scarcity, raise inflation, result in food insecurity, and ultimately affect in a disproportionate way those most in need. There are myriad factors that we can point to as causes of international instability and insecurity. As this Council has recognized, sustainable peace can only be achieved by promoting security and development. We need comprehensive approaches that integrate political, security, development, human rights, and rule of law activities and address the underlying causes of each conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢巴西代表的发言，下面请加蓬代表发言。
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à remercier la Chine pour l'initiative de cette réunion qui nous donne l'occasion de nous pencher sur l'importance de promouvoir les principes essentiels de dialogue et de coopération dans le maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. Je remercie le secrétaire général Antonio Guterres d'avoir circonscrit la portée du dialogue dans le contexte actuel. Et je remercie également le président Gustavo Lovinen pour son intervention édifiante. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes à une période charnière du système international qui se trouve à un point d'inflexion historique. En effet, le monde se relève péniblement d'une pandémie qui a exacerbé ses vulnérabilités individuelles et systémiques et est en proie à une crise multidimensionnelle qui met en question l'ordre international actuel. Le contexte international est marqué par l'émergence de nouveaux pôles d'influence qui aspirent à reconfigurer les équilibres et les approches de la gouvernance nationale et internationale. De plus en plus multipolaire, le monde se cristallise à l'aune de la concurrence géopolitique entre plusieurs acteurs majeurs. Manifestement, l'avenir du monde qui se dessine à nous est politiquement et idéologiquement plus diversifié. Ainsi, à l'ordre international qui se dévoile semble faire place à la diversité des valeurs et nécessite un dialogue permanent en vue d'un consensus global dans l'approche des questions antagonistes au sein du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies et au-delà. Face aux rivalités entre puissances, face aux risques de recours ou de prolifération nucléaire, face aux pandémies dévastatrices, à l'insécurité climatique et à l'évolution du cyberespace qui se dressent comme de nouvelles menaces, il serait dangereusement naïf de miser sur les rapports de force ou les postures unilatérales. L'efficacité de l'action internationale est difficilement garantie dans une configuration d'affrontement de blocs sur le modèle de la guerre froide. L'interdépendance des enjeux globaux et l'interconnexion des économies nationales, des marchés financiers et des chaînes d'approvisionnement nous exigent de travailler ensemble, de dialoguer, de s'écouter et de s'accorder afin de répondre de manière appropriée, efficace et surtout collective aux menaces les plus graves pesant sur la paix et la sécurité internationale. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes impuissamment témoins de l'implacable réalité que les querelles de grandes puissances sur leur hiérarchie, sur leur idéologie et leurs intérêts stratégiques constituent un terrain fertile d'antagonisme majeur, de guerre de choix, de guerre par procuration, de guerre de prédation de ressources qui déstabilisent les États fragiles, notamment en Afrique. Le Conseil de sécurité, ce Conseil, se révèle comme le cadre idéal pour promouvoir le dialogue à l'échelle internationale pour relever des défis les plus complexes et assainir la compétition géopolitique et idéologique. Mon pays, qui n'a jamais connu de guerre ni de conflit armé, continuera de travailler pour favoriser une plus grande inclusivité diplomatique et un dialogue authentique et durable afin d'atténuer et gérer les différences géopolitiques et idéologiques inéluctables, les clivages et intérêts concurrents qui parfois tendent à donner du Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU l'image d'une tribune formaliste et bureaucratique régulièrement paralysée par des différends entre ses membres permanents exerçant leur droit de veto. Notre quête est dynamique pour un dialogue permanent doit nous amener à veiller à la mobilisation des efforts nécessaires pour trouver une issue aux crises émergentes, tout en s'assurant que les problèmes urgents ne détournent pas l'attention internationale des défis saillants et opérationnels qui déchirent partout dans le monde la sécurité et la dignité des peuples du monde. Monsieur le Président, les alternatives au dialogue permanent et au multilatéralisme sont peu crédibles dans la configuration de l'ordre international. Le dialogue entre nations et au sein des institutions internationales est l'atout majeur pour favoriser une plus grande stabilité internationale grâce à des consultations, à des négociations soutenues pour gérer les conflits émergents. Le dialogue a pour vertu de faire progresser la coordination entre pôles d'influence, de maintenir la stabilité internationale et de promouvoir un ordre fondé sur des règles. Il représente un juste milieu pragmatique dont le contournement débouche à des alternatives risquées et dangereuses. Monsieur le Président, coopérer suppose naturellement d'agir ensemble, de se concerter régulièrement, en temps de paix comme en temps de guerre, et d'aplanir les divergences. Cela implique de considérer ou de prendre en compte les attentes des uns et des autres et d'atténuer les tensions dans la perspective de rechercher le règlement pacifique des différends. Mon pays entend toujours privilégier le dialogue à la rupture, la coopération à l'isolement, les solutions politiques et diplomatiques à l'usage de la force et à la confrontation. Cette vision de la diplomatie est le fil conducteur de notre engagement international et demeure au cœur de notre narratif dans la recherche des solutions durables aux crises multiformes qui minent le monde. Monsieur le Président, notre ferme conviction demeure que les organisations régionales et sous-régionales sont des acteurs de référence pour enclencher le dialogue dans la prévention des conflits et dans la réponse efficace et durable aux crises internationales. C'est l'essence même de notre volonté d'apporter des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains qui est prônée par l'Union africaine et ses membres. Naturellement, nous demeurons lucides sur la nécessité de trouver des solutions collectives aux crises auxquelles nous faisons face partout dans le monde, car leurs conséquences ont bien souvent un impact direct ou indirect sur la destinée de chacun de nos pays et menacent les valeurs que nous partageons et défendons au sein des Nations Unies. Monsieur le Président, pour terminer, je voudrais réitérer l'appel solennel de mon pays à chacun des membres de ce Conseil et au-delà à chaque membre de la communauté internationale pour construire les passerelles du dialogue et faire tomber les murs de fragmentation qui nous divisent et nous déphasent des aspirations de l'humanité. Il est urgent de nous réconcilier avec notre vocation d'assurer ensemble la paix et la sécurité internationale pour les peuples du monde. C'est à cela que nous sommes engagés en souscrivant à la Charte des Nations Unies. Nous devons sans plus attendre et sans se lasser coopérer et dialoguer avec franchise et détermination au sein de ce Conseil, à la mesure des engagements souscrits et des responsabilités assumées en matière de maintien de la sécurité et de la paix dans le monde. Je vous remercie.
我感谢加蓬代表的发言，我也再次感谢。I wish to thank the Secretary General again and for his briefing and for his thoughts and wisdom. Thank you again. 我现在请法国代表发言。
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie à mon tour le secrétaire général ainsi que Monsieur Lovinen pour leur présentation. Monsieur le Président, vous l'avez dit en ouverture, la dégradation continue de notre environnement de sécurité et le retour de la compétition stratégique et militaire remettent en cause notre système international bâti sur la règle de droit, sur le dialogue et la coopération. Le Conseil de sécurité est la clé de voûte de ces systèmes. Il est de sa responsabilité d'utiliser toute l'étendue des prérogatives qui lui ont été confiées par la Charte des Nations Unies pour le préserver. Monsieur le Président, nous soutenons pleinement l'appel du président désigné de la 10e conférence d'examen du TNP de préserver la centralité et la primauté de ce traité qui constitue la pierre angulaire de l'architecture internationale de non-prolifération et de notre stabilité stratégique. C'est un rempart dans un contexte international inédit, marqué par l'agression russe de l'Ukraine en violation de ses garanties de sécurité et marqué par la persistance des crises de prolifération. Je souhaiterais souligner 3 points. Premièrement, certains États privilégient ouvertement des postures belliqueuses. La Russie démontre par son agression de l'Ukraine son mépris pour les principes de souveraineté et d'intégrité territoriale des États, qui sont pourtant au cœur de notre système international. Aujourd'hui, la situation à la centrale de Zaporijjia menace toute l'Europe. Nous soutenons le dialogue en cours noué entre les parties et l'AIEA pour permettre l'envoi d'une mission d'inspection dans le respect de la souveraineté de l'Ukraine. Nous saluons à cet égard les efforts menés par le secrétaire général qui a permis d'ouvrir une perspective positive. Second point, à la guerre ouverte entre États s'ajoute la persistance des conflits internes et le fléau du terrorisme qui affecte durablement les populations civiles, en particulier les femmes et les enfants. Les crises sont intensifiées par le changement climatique, dont les impacts sur la sécurité, notamment au Sahel, ne sont plus à démontrer. Affaiblissant les États, ces crises peuvent permettre à des milices ou à des mercenaires de prospérer et déstabiliser davantage les zones de conflit. Il y a une troisième tendance inquiétante. Le cyberespace et l'espace extra-atmosphérique deviennent des champs de rivalité stratégique, voire de conflits armés. La manipulation de l'information, qui trompe nos citoyens et sape nos démocraties, est amplifiée par l'hyperconnectivité. Plusieurs États cherchent ainsi à déstabiliser les systèmes politiques et accroître leur influence, quand d'autres verrouillent l'information pour éviter toute contestation. Il y a là un champ dans lequel il faut aller au-delà de nos habitudes. Nous devons réfléchir aux contours d'un dialogue renouvelé pour affiner notre compréhension commune de ces nouveaux champs, renforcer la gouvernance internationale et définir des règles de comportement responsables en associant de manière très étroite la société civile et les entreprises. La France continuera de s'engager pleinement pour assurer que ces espaces resteront ouverts, sûrs, stables et pacifiques. Monsieur le Président, pour conclure, permettez-moi de faire nôtre l'appel du secrétaire général à préserver la promesse de la Charte des Nations Unies. Cela passe pour la France par la promotion d'un multilatéralisme efficace qui respecte les droits de l'homme, les libertés fondamentales et les principes démocratiques. Je vous remercie.
谢谢。下面我请肯尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and Mr. Gustavo Slovinen, President of the 10th Review of the Conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, for their briefings. Mr. President, I commend you and your delegation for the choice of today's briefing. We embrace the discussion, believing that the survival of our species is dependent on the establishment of security based on dialogue and cooperation, not the combative threat of mutual and worldwide nuclear annihilation. Unfortunately, the international community is facing an increasingly dangerous confrontation between the great powers. In the past, we have regretted the increasing irrelevance of multilateralism. We do so again knowing that without it, humanity will suffer grievously as our greatest hopes are crushed by multiple interlocking crises. Mr. President, as you know, we have an agreement that, if embraced indeed as much as it is inward, offers us a hopeful basis for collective security. That agreement is the UN Charter, which we must not allow to go the way of the failed League of Nations. However present trends holding, it may well meet this unfortunate end due to its paralysis caused by the increasing conflict between defensive and offensive alliances of major powers. The effects are already devastating when it comes to the ongoing war in Europe and its worldwide effects. Unless dialogue is started to halt the war in Ukraine, the continuation of the logic that led to it will lead to ruin for all of us. Mr. President, we are at a fork in the road. Will the world's powers choose to embrace the guiding vision of the United Nations, or will they turn it into one more arena of their conflict and sap its will and means to protect international peace and security? The rest of the world, and Africa specifically, must not wait passively to be swept into the center of the storms being generated by this historic confrontation. It must not lead to us suffering the agony of proxy wars or out-of-control climate change and pandemics. Mr. President, the 1982 Palm Commission held out the hope that citizens and civil society would take a more active role in advocating for disarmament and security. Our argument today is that regions, and specifically Africa, have an important role to play. The future map of survival, as the New York Times dubbed the Palm Commission, will need to have Africa as both its subject and as a critical actor for its success. The world needs a prosperous, secure, and united Africa to successfully navigate today's major challenges, such as global insecurity and climate change. Africa's Agenda 2063 can therefore be a cornerstone for the emergence of a balancing pillar for international peace and security. We propose to our friends and partners today that aiding this ambition, or at a minimum, not impeding it, is in their fundamental interest. Mr. President, without stronger contributions to our common security by all regions and our multilateral instruments, destructive cold and hot wars and other major harms lie in our immediate future. There are many efforts required, but I will mention only a few that I urge you to prioritize in your analysis. First, we need to renew our ambition to undertake overdue reforms of the United Nations and particularly the Security Council. Africa's seats, in line with the Eswini Consensus and the CERT Declaration, offer the greatest hope for a balanced council. The African Union and other regional organizations also need to undertake every effort to strengthen their peace and security architecture to strengthen the impact of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. Second, the UN needs to assume greater responsibility for all peace operations against threats to international peace and security. In particular, there is a need to provide adequate and predictable financing, including through assessed contributions for UN Security Council mandated, African Union-led peace operations. There must also be adequate, predictable, and sustained financing for peace building. In this regard, we urge members to agree on an ambitious resolution on financing for peace building by the end of the 76th session. Third, it is an unfortunate legacy that the regions leading in development of nuclear weapons are also the most advanced in the development of militarized artificial intelligence. The UN and regional organizations must have a stronger voice in ensuring that this technology is developed ethically and in line with the principles of the UN Charter. Fourth, common security is not attainable without development. In particular, there must be renewed energy shown by industrialized countries to meet and exceed commitments for climate change adaptation and mitigation. COP27 in Egypt will be a key test. Fifth and finally, militant non-state actors, and in particular terrorists, can fatally undermine our common security. We call for stronger efforts by the Council to predictably and consistently use its full range of tools against all terrorist entities and their collaborators. Mr. President, Kenya will continue playing its part in promoting dialogue and cooperation for the sake of common security. We have played an essential part in the forging of political solutions to multiple conflicts and even to head off state collapse in our region. At the moment, we are undertaking every diplomatic and political effort to facilitate and assist the Democratic Republic of Congo to solve the crisis in its eastern region through the Nairobi Conclave and the inter-Congolese dialogue. We make these efforts alongside our neighbors and partners in the firm belief that dialogue and cooperation, not confrontation and conflict, are key to ensuring our citizens and all people live in peace, security, and shared prosperity. I thank you for your attention.
谢谢。下面我请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank the Secretary General and Ambassador Levinen for your briefings and for your steadfast commitment to furthering multilateral diplomacy. Colleagues, we live in a world where our greatest challenges are shared, and global challenges require global solutions. That is what makes multilateral institutions such as the United Nations so valuable. The UN, unlike any other institution, can galvanize the world toward better ends. We cannot promote human rights. We can promote human rights. We can protect innocent civilians, and we can provide humanitarian relief, and we can save lives. We can strengthen sovereign equality and human flourishing, deter threats to peace and security, and work toward a more equal and more just world. But success requires good faith. It means not just quoting the UN Charter, but actually abiding by its principles in practice. And it requires us to hold member states accountable vigorously and consistently when they violate the Charter and the principles it stands for. Unfortunately, one of the greatest threats to our success to maintain peace and security is from within. At the top of the list is the full-scale invasion by Russia, a permanent member of this council, of its sovereign neighbor and fellow UN member state, Ukraine. Before Russia's unprovoked invasion, the United States, Ukraine, and its neighbors, as well as other member states, undertook intensive diplomatic efforts to dissuade Russia from choosing a path of force and violence. We convened dialogues at high levels across a range of international venues, including in this council, to voice concerns about the security situation and to discuss potential measures to revitalize Europe's security architecture. Russia, however, rejected dialogue, discarded established views of sovereign equality, discarded the concept of indivisibility of security, and launched an horrific war. Russia has justified its actions by attempting to redefine basic concepts like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the indivisibility of security. It has done so by asserting that it is Moscow's prerogative to dictate the political and security choices of its neighbors. You know, Russia is fond of saying that the security of one state cannot come at the expense of others. But Russia's tortured, full-throated messaging on the supposed threats it faces from its neighbors omits the fact that all nations have the right to choose their security alliances. Russia's interpretation of indivisible security does not justify one country's attempted annexation of another. This goes against not only the principles, but the explicit words of the UN Charter and its allowances for mutual self-defense arrangements. Russia's selfish desire to invade its neighbor and steal its land has had implications for us all. It has exacerbated global food insecurity. It has launched a new refugee crisis. It has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians. And it has degraded the bedrock principles that have prevented new world wars. The greatest mistakes of the 20th century came from the age of empires, when countries and people were not free to make their own sovereign determinations about their societies, economies, partnerships, and alliances. We cannot make those mistakes again. That is why we enshrine these lessons in documents like the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By protecting and promoting human rights, we protect what bonds us together, our shared humanity. That is why states cannot excuse their human rights violations under the guise of domestic internal affairs. Universal rights are and must be just that, universal. The language in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights could not be clearer. And finally, we came away from the 20th century in agreement that existential threats like nuclear proliferation needed to be monitored together, that we should use institutions and mechanisms established by the UN Charter, like the Security Council and General Assembly, to address these shared challenges to peace and security. That is the message President Biden and Secretary Blinken delivered just a few weeks ago at the onset of the 10th Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Review Conference. The United States will continue to support the NPT, which remains the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. At the review conference, we are seeking a consensus final document that preserves the integrity of this essential treaty and strengthens its implementation across all three of the treaty pillars to accomplish concrete and practical ways to move forward. It is also important that the review conference acknowledge the manner in which Russia's war and irresponsible actions in Ukraine seriously undermine the NPT's main purposes. That is why we believe resuming mutually beneficial inspections under New START or Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty is a key part of our cooperation that must continue. We are ready to negotiate expeditiously a framework to replace New START in pursuit of further bilateral strategic nuclear arms reductions with Russia. We're prepared to work with all countries on risk reduction and strategic stability efforts, and we will continue to support the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And we're eager to begin working with partners to restart negotiations this year on the long-delayed fissile material cutoff treaty. These global challenges require global solutions. They require good faith and adherence to established norms and international law. They require commitment and perseverance, which too often are in short supply. But we have to persist because our collective security hangs in the balance. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢。下面请英国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank the Secretary General and Ambassador Slovinen for their important briefings today. Mr. President, dialogue and cooperation are essential components for settling disputes and building peace and security. In this Council, we have seen some significant positive examples in recent months. In Yemen, sustained efforts, including Council members and regional actors, have brought us to a fragile truce. On Somalia, cooperation within the Council and with the AU led to the establishment of a new mission, ATMIS. But dialogue can only ensure our collective security if it is matched and underpinned by states upholding the international system that keeps us all safe. This must start with the Charter as the guarantor of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Today, there's no contest for the gravest threat to the system of common security enshrined in the United Nations. Russia, a permanent member of this Council, has torn up the Charter and trampled on the rules that underpin international peace and security. This undermines the entire system we are all here to uphold. To ensure all of our security and the system we rely on, we must hold to account states that transgress universally accepted norms, sovereignty, territorial integrity. If we accept that a big country can simply invade its smaller neighbour, we return to dark days of human suffering, wider international instability, and conflict. This is why we call again for the Russian Federation to stop its illegal invasion of Ukraine and withdraw its forces. Mr. President, with the global system under challenge, we must do everything we can to avoid nuclear escalation. The Non-Proliferation Treaty remains the cornerstone of the global security architecture in this area, and the only route to our shared goal of complete nuclear disarmament. The joint statement on this subject in January from P5 leaders was an important signal of a willingness to work together to reduce risks and build confidence. And in this context, we thank Mr. Slauvonen for his tireless work as President of the NPT Review Conference. The United Kingdom remains unwaveringly committed to its aims and to working with other states to ensure implementation of the NPT and other treaties. So we echo the concern of the Secretary-General about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in southern Ukraine. He has our support in efforts to de-escalate the situation. We also underline the importance of a mission of IAEA experts to address nuclear safety, security, and safeguarding concerns in a matter that respects the full Ukrainian sovereignty over its territory and infrastructure. Mr. President, the UN Charter and the international security architecture that we collectively built are crucial for all of our countries. Let us defend that together to ensure a world in which all sovereign states can ensure the safety of their people and the integrity of their territory. Thank you.
谢谢。下面请挪威代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General and Ambassador Slovinen for their informative briefings, and we thank China for convening this very timely meeting. The world is currently facing a multitude of immediate challenges in new and reinforcing ways, from the pandemics to climate-related conflicts, cybercrime, food insecurity, and a growing number of refugees. Conflicts have become increasingly protracted, with devastating effects on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Lack of protection fuels conflicts and is a threat to international peace and security. No state, no matter how powerful, can resolve all these challenges alone. Multilateralism must be at the heart of how we seek to deal with our global challenges. President, we need to take a more active role in preventing crisis. We therefore highly value that the Secretary General has made prevention a priority in his report, our common agenda, emphasizing the need to ensure that financing is adequate, predictable, and sustained. In searching for ways to facilitate early responses, we also need to improve the Council's situational awareness. Here, there is a key role for the Secretariat and UN briefers to use their interactions with the Council to bring emerging issues to its attention and sound the alarm. Working together with regional organizations such as the African Union is essential for the Council to understand and tackle emerging security threats, including the rise of non-state actors in conflict. In order to reach sustainable peace, Norway also strongly believes that we need to talk to all actors involved in any conflict. The full and meaningful inclusion of women is crucial in this regard. President, great power rivalry is putting pressure on the multilateral disarmament architecture. New weapon systems are being developed and deployed. Proliferation challenges are on the rise. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has helped to safeguard global security for more than half a century. It is the cornerstone of our efforts to rid the world of nuclear weapons. It is essential that we seize the opportunity during the ongoing review conference to reaffirm our commitment to the treaty. We would also strongly advocate the entry into force of the CTBT. We must persist in our efforts to prepare the ground for future binding arms control and disarmament agreements. In this regard, we emphasize to use the gender lens also on this work. Women and women's organizations are central actors in policy and advocacy on non-proliferation and disarmament. President, the UN Charter clearly prohibits aggression and acquisition of territory by force. Russia must immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and cease all threats and military actions. The recent shelling on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is of special concern. President, let me conclude with a concern we share with many around this table. The world currently faces unprecedented levels of acute food insecurity. Rising food prices are driving hunger in South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and other places. It is affecting livelihoods and multiplying the risk of further conflicts and instability. Russia's war on Ukraine has worsened the situation further with serious global impact. Norway commends the Secretary General for his contribution to the initiative on the safe transportation of grain from Ukrainian ports through the Black Sea. This is an important step and can prove to ease global food insecurity. President, the challenges we're facing require a holistic and inclusive response. We are all affected. Our efforts for collective security must be coordinated across all three pillars of the UN's work: peace and security, human rights, and development. I thank you.
谢谢。下面请加纳代表发言。
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank the Chinese delegation for organizing this important meeting to promote common security through dialogue and cooperation. We also thank the Secretary General for the depth and clarity of his statement, as well as Ambassador Gustavo Slovinen, President of the 10th Review Conference of the NPT, for his insightful briefing. 7 decades after the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, the world is increasingly witnessing strains to the structures of the global order, not only because there are new and emerging global threats whose resolution require effective national actions, but also because distance in time from the brutal images of the wars of the past, countries are beginning to consider ever more readily the threat of and use of force as an instrument for pursuing policies in the international arena. For many smaller countries, while there is an awareness that the rules-based order has not always been fair, the affirmation of the order is nonetheless firm, as it remains the key necessity in holding the stability of the modern international system. Most of us are only too well aware of the acute risk of a Hobbesian imagery if the international system of governance we have built in the post-war era should be fragilely maintained. As we therefore reflect over prevailing risks to the global system from threats such as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the risk of nuclear conflict, or its use by terrorist groups, terrorism, violent conflicts, pandemics, climate change, cyber attacks, disinformation, the migration crisis, and food and energy insecurity, we must be resolved to work our respective commitments to the Charter, as well as to the other commitments that we have made, including more recently in the declaration of the 75th anniversary. Mr. President, in considering how we can promote common security through dialogue and cooperation, Ghana seeks to share 5 main points. Firstly, as an overarching requirement, we must collectively work towards the strengthening of multilateralism in ways that make it to serve the needs of all and not the wishes of the few that are powerful or influential. The dialogue required for sustaining multilateralism must therefore change, and outcomes of decisions must reflect the common aspirations of all member states and be based, among others, on principles such as solidarity. In our mind, a strong multilateral system that upholds fairness and justice remains necessary in pursuing the common goal of maintaining global peace and security. Secondly, there have been far too many derogations in the obligation of some member states in relation to their own declaration at the point of joining the United Nations to accept the obligations of the Charter, especially as it relates to the purposes and principles. When this has happened with more powerful states, the organization has been constrained from acting. We therefore believe that in the present circumstances, it may be necessary to initiate a consensual process for member states to formally recommit to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, especially its key purpose, which is to ensure international peace and security, based on the pacific settlement of disputes, the non-use of force in international relations except under very limited and defined conditions, the development of friendly relations, and the pursuit of international cooperation in resolving international problems. Thirdly, while the development of friendly relations among member states was envisaged as one of the key tools in advancing the Pacific world order, we are only too aware of past actions that have been carried out by some states that undermine the territorial integrity and political independence of other states. Such actions create mistrust and weaken the common security we all seek. It is important to recognize that while more powerful states may have extensive security concerns, those concerns cannot by any stretch be subordinated to the domestic interests of other states, no matter how small they may be. This is the requirement of the principle of sovereign equality of states, and this is a principle necessary to be safeguarded in practice if we seek a more stable world. We therefore encourage deliberate diplomatic actions consistent with the Diplomatic Convention to build mutual trust, including by emphasizing dialogue in order to objectively assess the strategic intentions of countries and obtain a clearer understanding of national policy objectives and strategies. This is critical for dealing with misjudgments and avoiding unhealthy competition, especially among major powers. Fourthly, in the midst of prevailing geopolitical rivalries, the elevated risk over the deliberate or accidental use of nuclear weapons are a strong concern that the nuclear weapons states should cooperate to resolve. While nuclear non-proliferation is an important agenda that we must continue to work on, whether on the Korean Peninsula, in the Middle East, or elsewhere, the fundamental concern is that the idea of nuclear weapon itself is objectionable to humanity, and we should therefore work assiduously towards achieving a nuclear weapon-free world. This demand requires us to strengthen dialogue and cooperation so that the successes that have been achieved so far, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has helped to manage non-proliferation for 52 years, even though challenges still remain, and the 25 years moratorium on nuclear testing can be built upon. Finally, there are many situations of conflict, especially in parts of the African continent, where small arms and light weapons in the hands of terrorists and violent extremist groups have in effect been wielded as weapons of mass destruction. Such security threats of our time cannot be left only to regional and national actors to manage. The burden must be shared equitably, and renewed efforts and investments made in interventions that would accelerate progress towards the realization of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. In concluding, Mr. President, Ghana believes that the common security that we are all yearning for is possible and can be achieved. We therefore look forward to the further engagement of member states on our common agenda report, particularly as it relates to the new agenda for peace. While recognizing the importance of regional arrangements in advancing collective security, we also underscore the crucial role of the UN in promoting dialogue and cooperation for our common security, and believe that the equal platform provided by the United Nations enables states to develop common understandings on the application of international law and norms, rules, and principles for responsible state behavior. We need to jealously guard this multilateral platform. I thank you, Mr. President.
我谢谢加拿大代表的发言，下面请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, благодарим генерального секретаря ООН Антонио Гутерреша и председателя 10-й обзорной конференции дня Густаво Словинена за их брифинг. Признательны китайским коллегам за организацию сегодняшнего заседания Совета Безопасности ООН и выбор весьма актуальной темы, посвященной вопросам коллективной безопасности. Вряд ли кто-то может быть доволен той международной ситуацией, в которой мы оказались сегодня. Система международной безопасности находится в глубочайшем кризисе. Деградировали практически все институты, на которые она опиралась. Уровень доверия между ключевыми международными игроками опустился до критически низкой отметки. Сегодня как никогда важно понять, почему так получилось. Однако у стран Запада уже как минимум последние 200 лет одно объяснение для любых подобных проблем. Оно же и универсальный рецепт их решения – обвинять во всем Россию. Но давайте посмотрим на факты. В конце 80-х годов прошлого века у международного сообщества появились основания надеяться на то, что холодная война с гонкой вооружений и угрозой масштабной конфронтации между сверхдержавами остались позади. Многие эксперты всерьез рассуждали тогда о том, что блоковое противостояние тоже в прошлом. Прежде всего это происходило потому, что СССР, а затем Россия радикально сменили курс, реагируя на обещания и заверения стран Запада. Нас тогда заверяли, что НАТО не будет извлекать никаких односторонних преимуществ из изменившейся ситуации в Европе или создавать в ней новые разделительные линии. Нам обещали равноправное партнерство, основанное на доверии, транспарентности и взаимном учете озабоченности в области безопасности, которое в том числе подразумевало обещание не расширять НАТО на восток. Из записей, бесед и мемуаров западных политиков стало понятно, что нас банально и бессовестно обманывали. И ни США, ни их союзники ничего из обещанного не собирались выполнять. Ни о каком равноправном партнерстве никто не задумывался. Более того, страны Запада воспользовались нашими экономическими и политическими проблемами переходного периода, объявили Россию проигравшей в холодной войне. А проигравший в их понимании ни на что не может претендовать. Свои обещания не наращивать в Европе военное присутствие и не продвигать к границам России военную инфраструктуру члены НАТО забыли почти сразу же. Господин председатель, мы 30 лет терпеливо пытались договориться с НАТО о принципах равной и неделимой безопасности в Евроатлантике. Однако ответ на наше предложение мы постоянно сталкивались либо с циничным враньем, либо с попытками давления и шантажа. Североатлантический альянс при этом продолжал неуклонно расширяться, приближая свою военную инфраструктуру к нашим границам, в том числе размещая системы противоракетной обороны и наступательные вооружения. Все это создало реальную угрозу для национальной безопасности нашей страны. Наш президент предупреждал об этом еще в 2007 году в ходе Мюнхенской конференции по безопасности, призывал НАТО отказаться от этого опасного конфронтационного пути. К сожалению, эти предупреждения не были услышаны и восприняты на Западе. Наоборот, в 2008 году американцы и их союзники по Альянсу подтолкнули тогдашние грузинские власти на грубую военную авантюру против Южной Осетии и российских миротворцев. Авантюру, которая привела к катастрофическим последствиям для Грузии. Параллельно Соединенные Штаты целенаправленно демонтировали ключевые элементы глобальной системы контроля над вооружениями, которая на протяжении десятилетий поддерживала стратегический баланс и позволяла избежать вооруженной конфронтации. Еще в 2001 году Вашингтон заявил об одностороннем выходе из договора по ограничению систем противоракетной обороны под надуманным предлогом о том, что он якобы устарел и не отвечает современным реалиям. В 2019 году Соединенные Штаты точно так же в одностороннем порядке вышли из договора по ликвидации ракет средней и меньшей дальности, который генеральный секретарь некогда называл бесценным инструментом, способным предотвратить ядерную войну. Чтобы избежать нового витка конфронтации, мы предложили Соединенным Штатам и НАТО взаимный мораторий на размещение таких ракет. Мы даже взяли на себя односторонние обязательства не размещать первыми запрещенные ДРСМД системы в тех регионах, где не будут развертываться такие средства американского производства. Но наше предложение присоединиться к этому мораторию было отвергнуто США и их союзниками по НАТО. Симптоматично в этом контексте и то, что Соединенные Штаты по-прежнему отказываются ратифицировать договор о всеобъемлющем запрещении ядерных испытаний. Что касается самой Евроатлантики, то мы на протяжении многих лет делали все возможное для поддержания жизнеспособности режима контроля над обычными вооружениями. Россия была инициатором переговоров по адаптации договора об обычных вооруженных силах в Европе, ратифицировал соглашение об адаптации этого договора, которое позволило бы учесть новые стратегические реалии в Европе. Но США и их союзники по НАТО, которые к середине 2000-х годов уже полным ходом расширялось, это соглашение ратифицировать отказались. А натовские новобранцы 2000-х – Латвия, Литва, Эстония, Словения, Албания и Хорватия – в принципе отказались присоединяться к ДОВСе. Все это лишило договор какого-либо политического и военного смысла. В 2020 году США, по сути, подписали приговор еще одной из краеугольных договоренностей по укреплению доверия в Евроатлантике. Они в одностороннем порядке вышли из договора по открытому небу. Я хочу подчеркнуть, демонтаж каждого из упомянутых инструментов в области контроля над вооружениями стал результатом целенаправленных действий Соединенных Штатов, которые, по сути, камня на камне не оставили от сложившейся архитектуры в этой сфере. В декабре прошлого года мы предприняли последнюю попытку спасти агонизирующую под ударами со стороны западных стран систему европейской безопасности. Россия выступила с набором предложений к США и НАТО по мерам укрепления доверия и безопасности в евроатлантическом регионе. Мы предложили США заключить договор о взаимно-юридических обязывающих гарантиях безопасности, который учитывал бы озабоченности обеих сторон в этой сфере и возвращал бы ситуацию во взаимоотношениях между НАТО и Россией к 1997 году, когда был подписан основополагающий акт России-НАТО. Аналогичное соглашение было передано НАТО. Это открытые документы, и любой с ними может ознакомиться. В основе наших предложений лежал принцип единой и неделимой безопасности. Он подразумевает, что государства не должны укреплять свою безопасность за счет других государств. Это базовый принцип цивилизованных международных отношений. Он отфиксирован в целом ряде базовых документов ОБСЕ, включая Стамбульскую хартию европейской безопасности ОБСЕ 1999 года и вновь подтвержден в Астанинской декларации саммита ОБСЕ 2010 года и лежит в основе договоренности между Россией и НАТО. Но наши американские коллеги этот принцип подтвердить не пожелали, настаивая на святости политики открытых дверей для НАТО. Таким образом, все наши предложения по гарантиям безопасности были отвергнуты США и НАТО. Они просто отказались обсуждать их по существу и уже в который раз в истории предпочли дипломатическому регулированию эскалацию. В итоге на европейском пространстве разразился кризис, имеющий глобальную проекцию и без преувеличения исторические последствия. Причина того, что коллективный Запад все эти годы целенаправленно разваливал систему европейской безопасности, видим в том, что выверенная система сдержек и противовесов, баланса интересов перестала отвечать его гегемонистским устремлениям. Появился соблазн подчинить мир своему диктату и заставить весь мир работать и жить по лекалам западных стран. Коллективная же безопасность несовместима с принуждением и гегемонией, стремлением подорвать любые альтернативные суверенные пути развития, удержать страны и народы в тисках колониального по своему характеру порядка. В ход идут любые средства: групповые вмешательства во внутренние дела государств, государственные перевороты, угрозы, шантаж, экономическое принуждение, разжигание конфликтов. А в последние годы еще и грязные информационные кампании, основанные на вранье и презумпции собственной невиновности. Правда и факты в их контексте не играют никакой роли, ведь на очернение оппонента работают ведущие СМИ, западные СМИ и пиар-агентства. Так же, как и в свое время Грузия, в жертву противостояния с Россией принесена Украина, где Запад установил антинародный, антиконституционный и русофобский режим. Сегодня США и их союзники через накачку Киева тяжелыми вооружениями всеми силами стараются затянуть конфликт на Украине, начавшийся после того, как майданный режим в 2014 году обрушил на жителей Юго-Востока страны бомбы и снаряды, отведя украинскому народу судьбу пушечного мяса. При этом, вопреки собственным декларируемым ценностям, западные страны цинично закрывают глаза на распространение неонацистской идеологии, на массовое убийство жителей Донбасса и нарушение международного гуманитарного права вооруженными силами Украины и нацбатами. В последние недели западный покровитель Украины, по сути, помогает Киеву в его попытках ядерного шантажа, игнорируя факты обстрела ВСУ Запорожской атомной электростанции. На созданном Россией на прошлой неделе заседании Совета Безопасности ООН по этой теме ни у одной западной делегации не нашлось решимости назвать вещи своими именами и призвать Киев прекратить эти опасные действия, которые могут привести к радиационной катастрофе на европейском континенте. Мы запросили еще одно срочное заседание в связи с непрекращающимися провокациями ВСУ против ЗАЭС. Господин председатель, также безрассудно и провокационно США и их союзники действуют в Азии и Африке. В последнее время заметно активизировалась их деструктивная политика в Азиатско-Тихоокеанском регионе. Они пытаются навязать расположенным в нем государствам блоковое мышление, сформировать агрессивные военно-политические союзы типа ОКУС, вбить клин между странами, имеющими эффективные механизмы решения спорных вопросов и проблем, заставить их отказаться от концепции азиатского нейтралитета, которая помогла им защищать свои интересы в годы Холодной войны. В том же русле идет и американская авантюра в отношении Тайваня. Видим в этой тщательно спланированной провокации откровенную демонстрацию неуважения суверенитета других стран и своих международных обязательств. В общем, приходится констатировать, что АТР стал частью целенаправленной, сознательной стратегии США по дестабилизации обстановки в тех регионах мира, где расположены государства, проводящие независимую и самостоятельную политическую линию. Господин председатель, в эти дни в Нью-Йорке проходит 10-я обзорная конференция договора о нераспространении ядерного оружия, которая призвана консолидировать международное сообщество в выполнении его положений. Но и на ней западные страны политизируют работу над итоговым документом, ставя свои геополитические интересы по наказанию России выше коллективных потребностей в укреплении глобальной безопасности. В условиях фактического саботажа коллективным Западом глобальной архитектуры безопасности Россия продолжает делать все возможное, чтобы сохранить на плаву хотя бы ее ключевые, жизненно важные элементы. По нашей инициативе в феврале 2021 года на 5 лет продлено действие российско-американского договора о стратегических наступательных вооружениях. Мы выступили с инициативой переподтвердить принцип, что в ядерной войне не может быть победителей, и она никогда не должна быть развязана. В совместном заявлении лидеров ядерной пятерки, которое было принято 3 января этого года. В нем также подчеркнута необходимость не допустить не только ядерные столкновения, но и любую военную конфронтацию между ядерными державами. Крайне важно, чтобы все подписанты заявления на деле демонстрировали приверженность этим положениям. В принципиальном плане остаемся открытыми к взаимодействию по снижению напряженности, купированию гонки вооружений и минимизации стратегических рисков. Однако для этого нужно, чтобы в этом были заинтересованы и наши западные коллеги. Пока такой заинтересованности с их стороны не видим. Снизить напряженность в мире, преодолеть угрозы и риски в военно-политической сфере можно только через укрепление системы многополярности, построенной на международном праве, принципах Устава ООН и суверенном равенстве государств. Это единственная реальная и эффективная альтернатива гегемонии и праву сильного. Мы готовы активно участвовать в совместной работе вместе с нашими единомышленниками по построению подлинно демократического мира, в котором будут гарантированы права всех наций, обеспечены интересы их безопасности и гарантировано культурно-цивилизационное многообразие. Это важно сделать вопреки ожесточенному сопротивлению США и их союзников. Господин председатель, сегодня на наших с вами глазах формируются контуры нового мироустройства. Все больше стран выбирают путь суверенного политического, экономического и цивилизационного развития, отказываясь от навязываемых западными странами рецептов и шаблонов. Запад же готов на все ради сохранения своей гегемонии. Ради этого в жертву принесена Украина, превращенная в полигон для прокси-войны с Россией до последнего украинца. Надеемся, что действия Запада в этой стране многие в мире открыли глаза на истинную подоплеку охвативших нашу планету кризисных явлений. То, что происходит с Украиной сейчас, да и в целом поведение НАТО на европейском континенте в течение последних 30 лет, это урок для всего мира. Вы думаете, что в других регионах Соединенные Штаты и их союзники будут вести себя по-другому? История показывает, что это не так. Поэтому не спрашивайте, по ком сегодня звонит колокол. Он звонит по вам. Благодарю вас.
谢谢你的发言。下面请爱尔兰代表发言。
Thank you, President, and thank you to the Chinese presidency for organising this very timely debate. I'd also like to thank the Secretary-General and Ambassador Slovinen for their very thought-provoking statements. The UN was born from the trauma of the Second World War and a desire to ensure that we would never again go down the path of isolation, nationalism, global division and conflict. Multilateralism has been long central to Ireland's foreign policy. We believe that rules-based international order with the United Nations at its core remains essential if we are to achieve the promise of the UN Charter, to maintain international peace and security, and to respect the sovereignty of states. Unfortunately, we are seeing an increase in global and regional instability, exacerbated this year by Russia's unjustified and illegal military aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, no country can tackle the roots causes of conflict and the complex global challenges alone. Addressing climate change, inequality, poverty, cybercrime or terrorism require effective collective effort if we are ever to achieve sustainable peace. But the basic global consensus embodied in key regional and international institutions is being eroded. We must push back on such attempts while undertaking the institutional reforms that are necessary to maximise the continued legitimacy, relevance and effectiveness of multilateral bodies. President, to collectively address these complex and interconnected challenges, we must have a holistic and inclusive response, coordinated across all three pillars of the UN's work: peace and security, human rights and development. I would like to highlight three areas where we see an opportunity for cooperation in order to support peace. Firstly, we must move away from a default position of responding after a crisis has happened and be more proactive on prevention. Ireland joins the call outlined in our common agenda and spoken to by the Secretary-General this morning to enhance our support for the Peacebuilding Commission and ensure that peacebuilding is adequately and sustainably financed. The Peacebuilding Commission continues to advance its civil society engagement, increasing its advice to the Council, and as part of the wider UN peacebuilding architecture has contributed to discussions on peacebuilding financing. Ireland calls on others to support the entirety of the Commission's work and to engage constructively in the upcoming negotiations in the General Assembly. Secondly, we must recognise that disarmament and effective arms control is more vital than ever. During the Cold War era, the world too frequently stood on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. But today we are faced with an elevated nuclear risk. As we have heard from the Secretary-General, by adopting the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the international community took a decisive step back from that abyss. The NPT, as the cornerstone of the international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture, reminds us that even in the most dangerous of times, progress is achievable. As we meet today, the 10th Review Conference of the NPT is ongoing under the leadership of Ambassador Slevinen. It is our collective responsibility to bring urgency and action to nuclear disarmament, to address proliferation challenges and agree how we can move forward together to honour and implement our existing commitments. Our shared objective of a world without nuclear weapons demands that we act with courage and vision. Finally, and thirdly, we must ensure that our approach to peace and security takes a human rights-based approach that is inclusive, particularly of the most vulnerable. It is vital that we pay heed to women, youth, human rights defenders, and civil society in this chamber. It is essential that they can speak freely about the stark realities of conflict without any fear of reprisal or intimidation. Support to local peace builders, particularly women and youth, is key in finding local, sustainable solutions to conflict. By implementing the international frameworks we have collectively agreed to, be it the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the NPT, Peace and Security Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals, we can shape and build the world that was imagined when the United Nations was born. Thank you.
我感谢爱尔兰代表的发言，下面请印度代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary-General for his briefing and for his valuable remarks. I would also like to thank Ambassador Gustavo Slavinen for his intervention. The United Nations was established in 1945 with the noble objective of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. As the most universal and representative international organization, the UN has been credited with keeping the peace over the last 77 years. At the same time, going into the third decade of this millennium, we need to ask ourselves, has the United Nations lived up to its expectations? The requirements and challenges of our present and future are vastly different from those of the past. The world today is very different from the world of 1945. Is the UN, particularly the Security Council, which is the foremost organ tasked with the responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, able to remain relevant? Mr. President, we've all agreed that the world today is beset with multiple challenges. Terrorism, radicalism, threats and challenges from new and emerging technologies, climate change, pandemics, the intensifying geopolitical competition, and much more. Each of these directly affect the lives of one and all. An armed conflict in one part of the world has cascading effects on the people of another. We've seen the effects of the Ukraine conflict on other developing countries, particularly on the supply of food grains, fertilizer, and fuel. Meantime, the impact of the crisis in Afghanistan is being felt throughout the region. It is indeed appreciable that the UN has been at the forefront of dealing with these and many such challenges. Such efforts, however, have been partial or intermittent at best, as we have invariably stopped short of providing effective and durable solutions. It is clear today that the challenges the world is confronted with cannot be dealt with through outdated systems and governing structures. Mr. President, one of the guiding questions posed by the Presidency for today's meeting is, what constitutes common security? We're firm in our commitment to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. The underlying principles behind common security lie in upholding the rules-based international order, underpinned by international law, premised upon respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states, resolution of international disputes through peaceful negotiations, and free and open access for all to the global commons. Any coercive or unilateral action that seeks to change the status quo by force is an affront to common security. Further, common security is only possible when countries respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as they would expect their own sovereignty to be respected. Common security is also only feasible when all countries stand together against common threats such as terrorism and do not engage in double standards while preaching otherwise. And again, common security is also possible only if countries respect agreements signed with others, bilateral or multilateral, and do not take unilateral measures to nullify those very arrangements to which they were party to. Today's meeting is therefore an opportune moment to engage in a serious discussion about India's call for reformed multilateralism, at the core of which lies the reform of the UN Security Council. A body that was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, which continues to reflect in its decision-making, 77 years later, the fundamentally flawed premise of "to the victors belong the spoils," will continue to be confronted with a crisis of confidence and credibility. As my Prime Minister had said at the UN General Assembly in 2020, reform in the responses, in the processes, in the character of the United Nations is the need of the hour. How can we aspire for common security when the common good of the global South is continued to be denied representation in its decision-making? The most urgent thing, therefore, for us to do is to make the Security Council more representative of developing countries so as to reflect current geopolitical realities. How do we explain away the fact that the African continent does not have a permanent representation in the Security Council, despite a majority of issues being dealt with by the Council belonging to that region? How can we aspire for common security in Africa when the body denies them representation on a permanent basis? Mr. President, a truly representative Security Council is the most pressing need of the hour. Else, there is a real danger of the United Nations being superseded by other plurilateral and multilateral groupings, which are more representative, more transparent, more democratic, and therefore more effective. As a founding member of the United Nations, India has consistently displayed its commitment to hold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We've been the leading advocate of the concerns and aspirations of developing countries and the creation of a more equitable international economic and political order. We've contributed immensely and proudly to maintaining international peace and security as one of the largest troop contributing countries towards UN peacekeeping missions, having sacrificed the highest number of lives in that noble endeavor. We've also worked to foster global socio-economic development through transparent, viable, sustainable, and demand-driven partnership programs. The Council would recall that when COVID hit the world, we had extended our hand of friendship to other countries by delivering vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and other medical equipment to more than 150 countries across the world. Mr. President, India has been playing its part in being a trusted and reliable partner for all, based off our ancient Indian ethos that sees the world as one large family. However, the question remains, Are multilateral organizations, especially the Security Council, ready to deal with the new world order and new challenges? In my country, which now represents more than 1/6 of humanity, we believe that until we reform, perform, and transform multilateral governance structures, we would be continuing to be found wanting. Thank you.
我感谢印度代表的发言。下面请阿尔巴尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank the Chinese presidency for organizing this meeting, a timely opportunity to consider the ways in which dialogue and cooperation, our daily bread and butter, can contribute to maintaining world peace and security, especially at times when the world is in turmoil. We welcome and are grateful for the remarks of the Secretary General Guterres and the President of the 10th NPT Review Conference, Slovenia. We share the concern that, and that of many others today, that peace and security are under threat, and if these threats are not properly recognized and addressed, we face a bleak future. Mr. President, dialogue and cooperation represent a common and strong aspiration of people around the world. For us, this noble aspiration is not built in a void, but most and foremost on the norms and laws that we together have agreed upon since the establishment of this very body. Today, the world faces many serious challenges and a multitude of threats in shifting geopolitics. For many countries, peace and security, stability and progress, rights and freedoms are not part of the reality of their citizens. Seizure of power by force, terrorism, cyber attacks, climate change, transborder crime, and poverty continue to fuel violent and deadly conflicts in many parts of the world. But the erosion of fundamental norms established with the creation of the United Nations constitute a fundamental threat to world peace and security today. Article 2 of the Charter speaks for itself. It prohibits the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Yet, there are those who still defy it openly, blatantly, repeatedly, unforgivingly. The Russian invasion of Ukraine stands in flagrant violation of this obligation and of everything we have invested over the decades. Its indefensible assault on a peaceful neighbor has undermined the international order rooted in rules and respect. Therefore, this war of choice poses some urgent questions for all. Do rules matter? Does sovereignty have any meaning? Do we want a rules-based international order, or we want chaos and turmoil? And then what remains of dialogue and cooperation in face of an unprovoked invasion? The answer to these questions will define our future and the future of multilateralism with the UN at its core. Our common response will determine if we stand by international law or yield to big powers and their imperial appetites over their neighbors. If we stand by and contemplate the might to dictate the right, if we accept the arrogance of my way or the highway. Mistakes made in the past do not give to anyone, to any state, any credit to be used and do the same now or in the future. Therefore, let's not forget, what is happening in Ukraine today doesn't only concern that country and its citizens. It concerns the entire European continent. It concerns all of us. Mr. President, we also recognize and support the expanded notion of security. This entails an evolved, continued, and irreversible shift from the mere classical state security to human security, where the individual, the human person, takes central stage. But despite undeniable progress over more than 7 decades, respect for human rights around the world is in retrograde. Acts of violence and discrimination occur on a daily basis, and we are witnessing more and more human rights violations and abuses in all corners of the world. When human rights are violated, dialogue and cooperation suffer. Development and progress stall. Peace and security come under threat. Instead, when human rights are respected, societies are stronger, more resilient and stable. Countries develop faster, and this benefits dialogue and cooperation at regional and global levels. Mr. President, NPT remains the bedrock of the nuclear disarmament regime, as it was rightly recalled by the President of the 10th Review Conference. The core objectives of the NPT in its three important pillars: stop the spread of nuclear weapons, achieve universal nuclear disarmament, and uphold the right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, are key to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Russia's actions, including its decision to place its nuclear deterrent forces on a high alert earlier in February, and the continued saber-rattling of nuclear threat that come from different voices and actors close to the regime, go against cooperation, undermine trust, and threaten peace. In this vein, the occupation and the militarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is being used by the Russian forces as a springboard to launch attacks, constitutes an imminent threat, defying all IAEA safeguards and safety protocols. We reiterate our call for Russia to withdraw its military forces and for the establishment of an immediate secure perimeter around the nuclear power plant. Mr. President, with the multilateral global order shaken to the core, it is high time that we stop sleepwalking and bring dialogue and cooperation at the heart of our collective action, come together and take wise decisions benefiting us all. The pandemic has tested our resilience. Climate change threatens our very survival, and inaction will lead us all right against the wall. As DSG reminded us here today, the proposal made in our common agenda represents a roadmap to reaffirm multilateralism, bring back respect for rules and joint efforts for development, with the UN fit for the future challenges and crises at the heart of our common action. We strongly support the new agenda for peace, with a heightened focus on reinforcing human rights and freedoms, international law with a comprehensive and integrated approach to peace and security, including by addressing climate change challenges. We will be able to do better and achieve more by investing in prevention rather than always addressing symptoms. And for this, dialogue and cooperation remain crucial. Mr. President, challenges, crises, and disputes between states at regional or international levels will not disappear. They have been and will be part of international life. But what may and should change is the way we deal with them. If we opt for open, frank, and genuine dialogue while upholding the core norms agreed by all, we invest in fair solutions, we contribute to peace, to peaceful, secure, and a prosperous world. Through dialogue, states build trust. Through cooperation, they share mutually benefiting experiences, and together they stand always stronger than alone. It is only through dialogue, cooperation, and joint efforts that we can recognize and act upon the common aspirations of all human beings to live a dignified life, free from fear, want, or repression. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by stating what we have learned from our very own past. Peace and security do not come from a vision that is imposed, but rather by what is achieved freely and jointly, by acting together as friends, as good neighbors, as fair partners. Only then, dialogue and cooperation acquire the true meaning with shared benefits. And I thank you.
谢谢你的发言。下面请墨西哥代表发言。
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, México agradece a China por la iniciativa de convocar a esta reunión. También deseo agradecer al secretario general y al presidente de la Conferencia de Examen del Tratado sobre la No Proliferación de las Armas Nucleares, embajador Gustavo Slovinen, por sus intervenciones y reflexiones que sin duda enriquecen este debate. En un contexto en el que los retos emergentes como el cambio climático, las pandemias y la crisis de alimentos se suman a los ya tradicionales problemas de seguridad, queda claro que los enfoques unilaterales no conducen hacia la solución de los problemas, lo que, en cambio, sí ofrece la cooperación multilateral. México, como país comprometido con un multilateralismo eficaz, ha favorecido en todo tiempo el diálogo y la solución pacífica de las controversias para atender de manera temprana los conflictos y evitar que escalen. Como miembro de este Consejo, y en particular durante nuestra presidencia en noviembre pasado, mi país se ha dado la tarea de señalar el importante papel que juega la diplomacia preventiva. No podemos limitarnos a administrar los conflictos. La diplomacia preventiva y el recurso a los medios de solución pacífica de las controversias son los pilares para el mantenimiento de la paz. Para desempeñar una diplomacia genuina y eficaz, las Naciones Unidas deben fortalecer la coordinación entre sus órganos principales, la colaboración entre todos los órganos, agencias, programas y fondos de las Naciones Unidas, incluida, por supuesto, la Corte Internacional de Justicia y la Comisión para la Consolidación de la Paz. La amplia gama de recursos y herramientas con las que cuenta el sistema de las Naciones Unidas no se corresponde con los resultados que hemos visto en los últimos años. Señor presidente, las armas nucleares siguen representando la peor amenaza para la supervivencia misma de la humanidad. La llamada doctrina de la disuasión es en sí misma una amenaza de empleo de las armas nucleares. Y la amenaza del uso de la fuerza está prohibida por la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Por lo que no podemos normalizar la amenaza expresa o velada del empleo de las armas nucleares que esconden las doctrinas de la disuasión. La 10ª conferencia de examen del Tratado de No Proliferación, que se celebra actualmente, podría constituir una oportunidad para avanzar hacia el objetivo de lograr un mundo libre de armas nucleares. Sin embargo, México observa con honda preocupación el lento avance y, ante todo, la falta de voluntad política, particularmente de los estados poseedores de armas nucleares, para alcanzar acuerdos que permitan lograr dicho propósito. Pero estamos todavía a tiempo de revertir esta tendencia y recordemos en ese contexto la opinión consultiva de la Corte Internacional de Justicia de 1996 que sobre el artículo 6º del Tratado de No Proliferación señaló, y cito, que existe la obligación de los estados poseedores de armas nucleares de proseguir de buena fe y de llevar a su conclusión las negociaciones con miras al desarme nuclear en todos sus aspectos bajo un estricto y eficaz control internacional. Fin de la cita. México coincide con la visión del secretario general de que un mundo más seguro y en paz debe estar fincado en el derecho internacional, la cooperación y la solidaridad, y no en la incesante acumulación y modernización de los arsenales. Justamente fue esa visión la que llevó a los países de América Latina y el Caribe a establecer la primera zona libre de armas nucleares en un área densamente poblada a través del Tratado de Tlatelolco y la que condujo a la conclusión y entrada en vigor en años más recientes del Tratado para la Prohibición de las Armas Nucleares. Ese mismo espíritu de cooperación es el que quisiéramos se viera reflejado en las conversaciones que permitan regresar a un cumplimiento completo con el Plan de Acción Integral Conjunto y así resolver las cuestiones pendientes en torno al programa nuclear de Irán. Del mismo modo, la seguridad en la península coreana continúa siendo motivo de gran preocupación. En los meses recientes, este Consejo abordó las amenazas que representan los lanzamientos de misiles balísticos por parte de la República Popular Democrática de Corea. Ante la parálisis de este Consejo, derivado de un doble veto, la Asamblea General debatió al respecto. Y es evidente que se requiere reactivar el diálogo para lograr la total desnuclearización de la península. Llamamos a aquellos estados con mayor responsabilidad en ello a no escatimar esfuerzos para retomar la vía del diálogo y la cooperación. Señor presidente, México ha sido también inequívoco en su llamado a poner fin a la guerra en Ucrania. La población ha pagado el enorme costo de esta intervención militar. Llamamos nuevamente a un cese de las hostilidades y nos hacemos eco del llamado del secretario general a poner fin de inmediato a las actividades militares alrededor de la planta nuclear de Zaporilla y a no dirigir ataques en contra de la planta o a su alrededor en violación del derecho internacional humanitario. Urge llegar a un acuerdo que permita la desmilitarización de la zona a fin de que los inspectores del Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica puedan llevar a cabo las inspecciones técnicas que se requieran y eviten un accidente de consecuencias incalculables. La parálisis en la que nos encontramos en ciertos temas mina la legitimidad de los mecanismos de seguridad colectiva que hemos construido. Igualmente aumenta el déficit de confianza que ya existe por parte de la opinión pública en cuanto a la vigencia y efectividad del multilateralismo. Esta percepción no cambiará si no demostramos con hechos que la comunidad internacional y en especial este Consejo somos capaces de encontrar soluciones a los problemas comunes. Es claro que este Consejo no ha estado a la altura de su mandato en muchas ocasiones y se ha visto frenado por la voluntad de algunos de sus miembros permanentes. Por ello, México, junto con Francia, ha promovido una iniciativa para no recurrir al veto ante situaciones de atrocidades en masa. Suscribir esta iniciativa es una acción concreta en favor de la seguridad común. Invitamos a los estados que aún no lo han hecho, en particular a los miembros permanentes de este Consejo, a sumarse a esta iniciativa que cuenta ya con el respaldo de 106 estados. Muchas gracias.
谢谢你的发言。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。各位同事，我同样感谢古特雷斯秘书长和斯洛维宁大使刚才所做的通报。他们的通报充满了忧患意识，也分享了很多思考和建议，给安理会下阶段工作带来很多宝贵的启示。安理会各成员结合会议主题，深入阐述各自的看法。尽管立场不尽相同，但大家在一些根本性问题上还是有着广泛的共识。我们应该把这些基本共识转化为共同行动，发挥安理会应有的作用，更好地履行应尽的职责。各位同事，联合国宪章开宗明义，欲免后世再遭惨不堪言之战祸。76年过去了，实现共同安全的目标依然任重道远。时间的接力棒传递到我们手里，我们应该展现历史的担当，为实现共同安全做出应有的贡献。委员分享中方的几点看法。第一，我们要牢固树立符合时代需求的安全理念，这是实现共同安全的前提。必须认识到全球化时代，世界安危与共， 没有哪个人生活在真空里，没有哪个国家享有绝对的安全。各国要实现自身安全，就不能漠视他国的合理安全关切，就不能把本国安全建立在他国不安全的基础之上，就不能把自己的安全篱笆扎到别人家门口。安全不可分割，这是时代特征，也是实现共同安全的出发点。违背了这一点，再多的安全努力都会南辕北辙，陷入恶性循环的陷阱。当然，由于历史文化背景和发展阶段不同，各国在安全问题上总会出现不同的看法，产生利益冲突。面对分歧和矛盾，我们应该做的是通过对话合作找到最大的公约数，以和平方式解决争端。这是实现共同安全的必由之路。这条路有时虽然慢一些，但代表着正确的方向。抱着冷战思维不放，搞单边主义、零和博弈、集团对抗、强权政治那一套，既难以保障自身的长久安全，还会导致危机轮番升级，走向共同安全的反面。在这方面，北约几轮东扩引发的问题和带来的教训是深刻的。中国始终坚持共同、综合、合作、可持续的安全观。习近平主席提出全球安全倡议，就是针对当前国际安全困境，为推动实现共同安全所指明的方向和给出的中国答案。这一倡议是开放的，我们愿同国际社会一道，通过真诚务实的对话合作，以实际行动落实倡议内容，共同构建均衡、有效、可持续的国际安全架构，为我们的后世免遭惨不堪言之战祸做出应有的贡献。第二，我们要切实尊重各国主权和领土完整，这是实现共同安全的基础。联合国宪章确立的尊重国家主权和领土完整重要原则，是现代国际法和国际关系的基石。如果这一原则被忽视、被抛弃，整个国际法体系将地动山摇，这个世界将重回丛林法则，共同安全就无从谈起。因此，我们必须旗帜鲜明，始终坚持尊重各国主权和领土完整，尊重各国人民自主选择的发展道路和社会制度，尊重各国维护国家统一和民族团结的努力。这是国与国交往的黄金法则，也是实现共同安全的基础和边界。既然是黄金法则，就应该普遍适用，不能搞双重标准，更不能说一套做一套，为一己私利而背弃承诺。这方面我们已经有很多教训。阿富汗、叙利亚、伊拉克等国的遭遇，时时在警示我们，以反恐、民主、人权为幌子，干涉别国内政，不仅给当事国带来巨大损失和伤痛，也是对民主、人权、自由等全人类共同价值的亵渎，对实现共同安全有害无益。 中国一贯尊重他国主权和领土完整，坚守国际公平正义，支持国际社会为实现共同安全所做的努力。同时，我们也将采取一切措施，坚定维护自身的国家主权和领土完整。第三，我们要努力营造稳定的战略安全环境，这是维护共同安全的底线。在所谓大国战略竞争的思维驱动下，全球战略安全环境不断恶化。以不扩散核武器条约为代表的国际防扩散体系，面临冷战结束以来最严峻的挑战。我们同意古特雷斯秘书长多次发出的呼吁，应对核威胁的唯一途径就是没有核武器。拥有最大核武器的国家、核武库的国家，应该履行特殊优先责任，以可核查、不可逆和具有法律约束力的方式，进一步大幅实质削减核武库。这将为其他核武器国家加入核裁军进程创造条件。今年1月，5核国领导人发表联合声明，强调核战争打不赢，也打不得，重申不将核武器瞄准彼此或其他任何国家。这一郑重承诺在当前形势下至关重要，有助于增进大国互信，防止核战争，避免军备竞赛，让世界陷入更大灾难。从拥有核武器的第一天起，中国就倡导全面禁止和彻底销毁核武器，始终恪守在任何时候和任何条件下不首先使用核武器的政策，明确承诺无条件不对无核武器国家和无核武器区使用或威胁使用核武器。中国是5个核武器国家中唯一做出上述承诺的国家。我们敦促其他核武器国家采取同样的政策，共同维护全球战略稳定，切实减少核战争风险。第四，联合国是维护共同安全的最重要平台，我们要支持联合国继续发挥核心作用。有效的全球安全治理体系是实现共同安全的必要条件。联合国安理会是国际集体安全机制的核心，是多边安全体系最具权威性和合法性的机构，是在维护共同安全方面发挥着不可替代的作用。我们要坚持真正的多边主义，支持联合国及其安理会发挥有效作用，积极回应时代需求和各方期待。安理会成员要增进互信，减少对抗，加强团结合作，维护安理会的权威和效力。我们要在推动政治解决争端方面下更大功夫，同秘书长斡旋努力形成合力，更好地应对当前挑战，保障共同安全。我们要在发展领域加大投入，构建全球发展伙伴关系，以发展促安全，以安全保发展，谋求共同安全、共同发展。我们要坚守公平正义，让占有联合国绝大多数的发展中国家，特别是非洲国家，拥有平等权利，发挥更大的作用。古特雷斯秘书长正在制定新和平纲领， 他在刚才的通报中介绍的工作考虑具有一定针对性，对国际社会有效管控安全风险、完善安全治理具有指导意义。中方期待新和平纲领抓住广大会员国最关切的问题，反映会员国共同的呼声，着眼于打造共同的未来，为实现共同安全注入新的动力。中方愿同各方一道，以联合国为核心平台，统筹传统和非传统领域的安全，共同应对地区争端和恐怖主义、气候变化、网络安全、生物安全等全球性问题，通过携手合作，把我们的世界建设得更加和平、更加安全、更加美好。我谢谢大家。我现在继续行使安理会主席的职能。现在在发言名单上没有其他人了，我宣布现在休会。Thank you.